Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Karla Wilke about how to keep cows performing optimally during harsh winter conditions. It's another practical and insightful episode that you are sure to enjoy. And with that, I think it's just best if we get on to the conversation and hear from Karla. Well, Karla, welcome back to the show. It's been a few months since I've had you on, but I'm excited to bring you back. Last time we talked a lot about kind of making sure those heifers can stay in good shape and breed back a little better and taking care of those high-risk females. And today we're going to talk about some cold stress management, but also touch on that body condition scoring again and just make sure that we're taking care of everything so that they can perform optimally for our environment. So thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So remind the listeners a little bit about what your role is in the beef industry.
So I am the cow-calf and stalker management specialist for the University of Nebraska, and I'm based out in the Panhandle, so the western end of the state. And then my husband and I run about 130 mama cows on top of farming. It's an integrated farming and ranching operation.
So you very much have your you have your own stake in the game, and then you get to help a lot of other producers too. That's always great. So, with the cold stress management topic, can you touch on, before we dive too deep into that, what impact does that cold weather have on cattle performance, and kind of where is that threshold where their performance is going to be impacted?
So it's a great question, but there's lots of things that impact where that threshold is. So kind of in a general standpoint of things, we would consider that their threshold to be about 20 degrees Fahrenheit for a critical, cold temp. But those things are very much affected by body condition score, how much fat cover the cow is carrying over her, how much wind she's facing, how much, if she got wet, maybe it rained before it started snowing and the wind started blowing. So if the coat is wet, then she can't handle that as much. And then windbreaks, that kind of thing, can also play a big role in how low that critical temperature can get and when it starts to really impact or stress that animal out.
I mean, I know you said there's multiple factors with the windbreak, etc. And then, was she wet before? But say it's just that 20 degrees calm day. What body condition score does that correlate to?
So what we would like to see in our cows going into winter is that they maintain between a 5 and a 6 on a 1 to 9 scale. So they're right in that moderate range. A thinner cow is going to have a lot more trouble maintaining her body heat, and her nutrient requirements are higher because she's needing to put some condition back on because she's so thin, but then the weather conditions may be increasing her requirements just for maintenance. And so now all of a sudden we've got a cow that's behind the 8 ball, if you want to say it that way, but she's needing to do more than just maintain herself, but she's needing more just to maintain herself.
And so with body condition scoring, when should ranchers be taking those scores so that they can help those cows maintain that moderate condition?
I think it's really critical that producers body condition score their cows several times a year. And that may be 4, that may be 3, that may be 5, whatever. But it's always better to be proactive than reactive. And especially when we're talking about changing a body condition score. And so if we're evaluating those cows, say late summer, and we're starting to look at them, and we've got an awful lot of cows in our group that have been pulled down to a 4, and the grass is dried up and there's not much out there, that's a time that we can start making decisions about early weaning, supplementing the cows, anything like that. When we wait and we wean, and the cows are really thin, and winter's already hit, now we're trying to react to how do we fix this instead of how do we head it off. And so that's one reason that I like to encourage people to evaluate that several times a year. One of those times being, when the pairs are out there on grass and we're late summer or whatever, we're not even really thinking about having to supplement or do anything like that. But where are we now? Do we need to do something different, or are we on track? So that's one place. And then when we are weaning and preg checking, do we have a group of cows that we want to sort off separately and maybe feed them a little differently, or as a group, do we have some time frame here that we're gonna put them on a little better quality feed? One thing I think that producers know, but they maybe kind of forget, is that lactation really pulls about twice the nutrient requirement that just gestating does. And so, if we can say, well, those cows are, on the average, there's more 5s and 4.5s than I like. I'd like to see more 5.5s and 6s, but it's October and we're going to take lactation away. So now that her requirement is half almost what it was, and then I've got this feed that will easily meet that, then I know that before winter storms hit, I've got this much time. She should gain, a condition score, half a condition score, whatever. That's going to put the majority of my cows in a pretty good spot going into winter. What can happen to people is if they're thinner at that point in time than they want, and it's later in the year, maybe they ran long on grass and kept the pairs out there longer, or something happened, or snowstorms hit early, or whatever, and those cows are thinner, now you're up against trying to get them to gain some weight at a little faster rate, which is going to require more supplementation, that kind of thing.
Okay. Now, one thing you and I talked about kind of off camera before I hit record was that it might be tempting for some producers to leave pairs out on grass a little longer, depending on if they're in a region that got a little more rain this year. Do you want to touch on that and just share how producers need to still be cognizant of the condition score of those cows and how weather patterns are going to change?
Yes, that's a good point. So that grass that grew very tall because we had a lot of rain in certain regions is pretty mature, and it probably went to stem really fast, and so the quality of that is a little lower, even though there's a lot of quantity out there. And so people are tempted sometimes to use that instead of pulling the calves and feeding some hay, whatever, later to the cows. And that kind of shifts then that time frame that they have between pulling lactation away from that cow and winter storms. It shortens that up. And so be very aware of the body condition score of those cows and whether that's really what you want to do at that point.
So, Karla, what else do you want to talk about related to body condition score before we kind of go back to some of those cold stress management tips and strategies that we'll share with the group?
The thing to always remember about body condition score, and this can be a little deceiving when you've got that mature grass that we might have left them out there on a little bit, is that gut fill can be very deceiving when we're trying to look at the fat cover over the ribs and the brisket and the tail head. So we look at this cow and she comes walking at us and she's got this huge gut. So a cow that has a lot of gut fill can look like she's big and fat, but if it's just gut fill and it's not that fat cover over her ribs and her tail head and in her brisket, then it's not body condition score. And so that can be deceiving. You need to watch for that. Hair coat this time of year starts to get thicker with the shorter day length, and so that can mask some cover over the ribs that you might assume, that cow looks fine, but if she were that same body condition score in the summer with really short hair coat, you'd see those ribs a lot more visible. So watching those things, making sure that we are evaluating body condition score, not hair coat or, gut fill or that kind of thing.
Are you looking for new ways to beef up your favorite beef meals? Let me introduce you to my favorite seasoning, pluck. I pluck my steaks, I pluck my burgers, I pluck my eggs, I pluck just about everything I cook because this variety of seasonings not only complements animal protein, but also allows me to incorporate organ meats into my diet without tasting them. You can try it for yourself at eatpluck.com and use the code Shaye Wanner for a 15% discount. That code is spelled ShayeWanner. And again, that website is eatpluck.com. With Body Condition Score, what tips do you have for helping producers feel confident in making those scores and getting comfortable with it? I mean, I know some people, like, I grew up evaluating that, doing it, etc. And in college, I remember it was just a part of our courses, but everyone's experience and knowledge is different, especially for first-generation producers. So how can ranchers get more comfortable and knowledgeable on calling those scores themselves on their own herd?
I think there's a lot of university publications out there. I know University of Nebraska has one, and other universities, extension groups have them as well. But they kind of help you determine objective points of evaluation that you look at to give a subjective score. And so while it is a little bit subjective to say, oh, she's a 4, she's 5, whatever, there are very objective points of fat cover, you know, looking at the brisket, looking at the tailhead, looking at the pin bones, looking at the front ribs. And so learning to kind of evaluate some of those things, maybe look through some of those publications that have some pictures that go along with, you know, those scores. I have helped producers sometimes by sending them 3 pictures, picture of a cow of 4, picture of a cow of 5, picture of a cow of 6, and say, tell me where your cows, which one of these looks like your cows. And then that kind of helps me know that we're on the same page, and then, you know, recommendations I maybe need to make for supplementation or, you know, making management changes, whatever, because then I feel more comfortable that we're on the same page and I'm not calling a, you know, what I may see as a 5, maybe they think is a 6 or whatever. We're a little more on that same page. So there's different things people can do. I think lots of helps out there that can help people.
Now, you know, we talked a lot about body condition score, and that's going to impact performance of cattle when they're stressed in the cold or when those temperatures drop. You also talked about wind. So do you want to talk about maybe some different options that ranchers can put into place to help those cows perform better? I know it's going to depend on where people have them. If you are out grazing stocks, or if you have them closer to home, or wherever it may be. So can you just share some tips and strategies there?
So wind can be a really hard thing on cattle, can really increase their nutrient requirements to just maintain their body temperature when the wind chill is really bad. But amazingly, if you can get them out of the wind, they can handle some pretty low temps, especially if they're in a decent body condition and they have some feed for them. You know, shelter belts, tree strips are nice. Metal windbreaks that have been erected can certainly help cattle, you know, have a place to come in, keep them from drifting. If you feed them where the windbreak is, a lot of times when we know there's a storm coming, we can feed them next to those windbreaks, and they're certainly going to utilize that. We've even done things where we put stacked the big square bales of straw, and, you know, 2 to 3 high, in around a pen on the outside of the pen, just to make a temporary windbreak because a storm was coming in, and where these cattle were, they maybe didn't have the best one or whatever. The other thing to keep in mind, I don't know how many of your listeners have a fall calving herd, but those calves are a little more susceptible to the cold than a mature cow, and that particular cow is lactating. So now she does have that requirement for lactation on top of her maintenance, and she has that calf. And so I think a windbreak for them is even more critical because it allows them to get in a smaller area, share some body heat, protect them from the wind, makes your feed go a little farther for those cows if you happen to get in a storm like that. Some years, you know, we don't have horrible storms, and some years they start in October. So. And
what about bedding for those mature cows?
So bedding can certainly help take that cold from the ground, you know, away from them, and make that a little better. And I think especially with the pairs, that's very helpful to the calves. It can certainly help the mature, you know, the dry spring calving cow as well. It's not going to hurt her, but it might be more critical for your bulls. because the wintertime, when they are exposed to extreme cold for a length of time, which we can get into as well in the winter, that's when we can have frostbite injury to the testicles, and then come spring that bull doesn't test, and that's very frustrating, and especially if we could have prevented that with some bedding and a windbreak, you know.
So if producers know that a cold snap is coming, how should they be feeding their cattle differently leading up to that, if at all?
Well, it doesn't hurt to provide a little extra feed, maybe 20% more, when you know it's fixing to snow and they're predicting a blizzard and that kind of thing. Because that heat of fermentation in the rumen helps produce heat to help those cows produce body heat to keep them at a decent comfort level during that storm. And so increasing that can help. If you're doing a total mixed ration and you increase the feed a little bit, maybe you add a pound or two of corn per head per day or something, that can also be a way to add some energy, that kind of thing. It's important to keep in mind what happens sometimes is those cows are out there foraging for themselves on a cornstalk field, and say it's January or February, so the goodie in the cornstalk field is gone, so there's not much out there for them to eat, and they don't have a windbreak, and they're thinner than you realize because they've got a winter coat on, that kind of thing. That's when we can really get into a disaster. And then come spring, she gives birth to a calf, and she's thin, and she didn't put a lot of nutrients into the colostrum for that calf, and so the calf doesn't do that great, and then she's already so far behind the 8 ball that subsequent calf she doesn't come up bred with, And so the winter thing can be a snowball effect well into the spring that we don't often realize, that we're setting some things in motion that are going to hit us down the road because we're trying to save a few bucks here in the winter and make those cows do it on their own. And there's certainly something to be said for having cows that fit your environment. I'm not saying that we just need to feed the daylights out of everything, but if she can't meet her requirements and we get into some weather that increases that requirement, there can be a chain reaction to that down the road that we will eventually pay the price for.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who want to learn more about that topic, Karla and I talked about that a lot a few months ago, and I'll link that podcast, or I'll try to remember to link that podcast in the show notes. But, we were specifically talking about some of those younger high-risk females, but it applies to all the cows too. Karla, what else haven't we touched on that you think is important to bring up today?
Well, the cow that gets wet with maybe it starts raining and then that turns to snow as the temperature drops or whatever. That cow struggles some too because her coat has gotten wet. Now she's chilled. And so watching that weather forecast, and that's definitely a time to make sure that we can provide them some windbreaks and that we can get some extra feed in them, because that's hard on them too. And we've all seen those cows that are walking around with, they almost look like polar bears with little eye spots on them or whatever, and they look cold. And honestly, that's a good thing, because what that tells us is that that coat and the fat layer beneath the coat is keeping the body heat in, and the snow is freezing on the coat, but the body heat is not leaking through that to then melt that snow, on that cow. And so, in fact, that cow's probably doing a lot better. She looks awfully cold to us, but she's doing pretty good because she's able to conserve that body heat. The cow that we need to really worry about is the cow that doesn't have much for a winter coat, doesn't have any body condition score, doesn't have any body fat to condition her against that, to save that. And then she's going to get wet and cold and fight the wind. And that cow's nutrient requirements can double, And so if we're still out there expecting her to forage around on a dormant winter range pasture or a cornstalk field, like she has a requirement for 8 pounds of TD in a day, and she's actually up to 13 or something, or 14, where's she supposed to get that? And if it's been a long winter and she has used those reserves, and she's used those reserves, so we get to February and we have a cold snap in Nebraska is not uncommon for us to have a cold snap of, 30 or 40 degrees below zero. Obviously, cows in Montana, they live that way. And so, but they got to have the reserves to make it through that. And so if this cow was thin coming off of winter range, let's say coming out of weaning, she was thin. Snowstorms started early. There wasn't a lot of quality in the diet that she had. And she began to use those body reserves to get her through the November, December snowstorms and cold snaps. By the time we get to January and February, she has nothing left to give. And so then we're surprised because that cow goes down out there, or we all of a sudden realize she's in a body condition score 3 or whatever, and we're like, wow, what happened? Well, it didn't happen overnight, but it happened all winter.
Well, and sometimes it's tough because you bring in maybe some of those older cows in the fall once you wean or PG, and you think, yeah, we can get another year, but then they go through the winter and you're like, well, that was tougher on her than we thought it was going to be. So,
right. And that can be really tough on those really old cows. And then, of course, the very young cows that we talked about in our last podcast have such a high requirement for growth. But that old cow, that's hard on them too. Holy buckets. That's going to be so hard on an old cow. So, yeah, if we're going to get one more year out of them, we kind of need to make sure we have the feed resources for that, or the management conditions that we can, put in the windbreaks, do the extra feeding if we have to, that kind of thing. If they're predicting a blizzard and you're not sure you're going to get there with the feed after the snow, by all means, get it out there in advance, because there isn't going to be anything worse than not being able to get to those cows with feed once it all hits.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Karla, I really appreciate your perspective as always, and you sharing your firsthand experience and professional insight with the listeners. Where can people go to connect with you if they have more questions?
My email address is kjenkins2, so KJENKINS, the number 2, at unl.edu. And, if they want to drop me an email and say, hey, I've got some questions on this, and here's my phone number, and can you call me, and I want to visit with you, or I need some help with a ration to get from this point to this point or whatever, then I'm happy to, assist with that.
All right. Well, folks, thank you for tuning in today. Remember, the best way to promote this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating and review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this information valuable. I will include any resources mentioned in the show notes, and if for some reason I forget, go to my website and contact me, and I'll make sure you get it there. I love when you guys reach out there. But with that, happy ranching, folks.